The competing Marshall and Molotov plans drew distinct lines between the two global powers. One could argue that it was just the beginning of Stalin showing his true colors. The Cominform, the new Soviet intelligence agency, began an aggressive effort to keep the occupied territories in line. In 1947, Hungary endured a political purge that removed all anti-communist leaders. Their primary method was rigging elections. In Czechoslovakia, they similarly purged all non-communists from leadership positions and amassed troops on the border just to make sure that they all knew the score. This all set the stage for a showdown over Germany. As World War II came to a close, one of the greatest concerns was to how to prevent Germany from initiating another global conflict. Many ideas were kicked around, including one by President Roosevelt, where they would just turn Germany into a giant pasture. Ultimately, it was determined that a recovered Europe would need Germany to regain its industrial might. As an effort to pursue both an industrial, powerful, but militarily non-threatening Germany, it was determined to cut it into four parts. Berlin, Germany's capital, would also be carved into four parts. Each of these parts would be occupied by one of the three World War II allies, plus France, as it was likewise determined that a rebuilt and potent Europe needed a strong France as well. Generally, each was responsible for overseeing the rebuilding of their quadrant. Issues started to arise when it was realized that the Soviets were stripping their German quadrant of all of its wealth. France was feeling similarly vindictive. Just as Russia had been twice victimized by Germany in consecutive global wars, so had the French. So they also were using their German quadrant to exact reparations. Making matters worse for all opposed to the spread of communism, the Communist Party in France was winning votes legitimately. In order to boost trade, it was embraced that they would no longer need to view Germany as a place from which to remove wealth, but to become a partner with whom they could harvest, manufacture, and trade goods. One of the reasons for this was the British were flush out of cash. This was a large part of the reason why the United States was creating policy that would lead to freeing up loans to allies. This included the Soviets, who had asked the Americans for a sizable loan during World War II, but they were told to wait. Ultimately, Truman tried to use the prospect of receiving loans as the means of coercing the Soviets to do what he wanted, and as they waited for Truman's terms, they watched him give the British a $3.75 billion loan. These increasing financial tensions were furthering geopolitical issues that had been driving the Grand Alliance apart. As the Soviets and French were exploiting their zones as a means of reparations, the British and Americans merged their zones to try and hasten Germany's return as an industrial power. The merger formed Bizonia, and would eventually include the French and would become West Germany. The urgency was expressed by former President Herbert Hoover, who suggested that the West could keep Germany in economic chains, but it would also keep Europe in rags. Stalin began to feel the Western powers coalescing around him and determined he needed to act. Any pretenses were cast aside when the Americans refused to continue to send reparations to the Soviets from their zone. They also began insisting that Germany would never be unified under any circumstances the Soviets might agree to. So Stalin attempted to intimidate the West into forfeiting their quadrants of Berlin to him. The German capital was deep in Soviet-occupied territory, and Stalin thought he could apply pressure to extract better conditions from the United States by emphasizing the geographic disadvantage they faced. He cut off all access points to Berlin and essentially placed the city in a chokehold and dared the Americans to do something about it. This sparked an even greater flight from communist-controlled territory as Germans voted with their feet by fleeing to the West. Stalin turned up the pressure, thinking he would either have the Americans back out of Berlin and look weak internationally, or they would have to defend West Berlin with its military. World War III would start, but Stalin wouldn't be viewed as the aggressor. Rather,